Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Before we start today's session, please note that this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, look out for a globe icon on your screen, click on it, select your preferred language, and mute the original sound. Today, we are looking at casual developments, with interveners coming from Ghana and Mozambique. But before I hand over to Jim, I'd like to acknowledge our partners who continually make it possible for us to bring this session to you. And I'm talking about GIZ Move, CNFA Pro Cashew, Mayor, SNI, Intersnack, just to mention a few. Jim, I see you already set. You may continue with today's session. Thank you.
Good morning, Blessing. Good morning, everyone. You're very welcome. This is our 37th session, and it has the usual kind of format. We're going to start off and talk about the markets, and then we're going to move on to our specialist subject for the day, if you like, and that's about cashew policy. And in particular, we'll ask the question, is cashew policy supporting the sector? To do that, I'm joined by two guests that I'm very happy to welcome today. Lucia Antonio from the Institute of Cashew Nuts of Mozambique, and Forster Boateng of the Tree Nuts and Crops Development Authority of Ghana. So they're going to talk to us a little bit later on, and we'll dig in at that stage a little bit more into policy in the sector globally, but with the real focus on Africa, of course. So let's have a quick look then at our market indicators this week. Starting as usual with the farm gate, which is kind of receding at this time of year. We're into July now, of course. Crops are coming to an end. Guinea-Bissau is probably the last of the major suppliers to export. I think there's still quite a bit of material left to be collected, and certainly quite a bit of material still left to be shipped. The usual difficulties of infrastructure. And we're going to talk a little bit about infrastructure later on too. If we look in the international raw cashew nuts market, prices have eased a little, but so has quality, and the price drop tends to reflect the quality. The market might be a little bit softer, just on relatively quiet trading. We've seen a lot of imports into India in recent weeks. Indian import figures look pretty healthy for the time of year, and those new arrivals are now in the market ahead of the major festival season usage, which is coming up. Looking at the kernels market, we've seen in the last couple of weeks quite a sharp dip in FOB prices for 320s, mostly for nearby positions, mostly for processors who are possibly in a little bit of difficulty with their cash flow, need to move some product, people who don't usually have the ability to sell forward. There is a slightly different market then if you look at forward. There are more inquiries now for forward positions. Although July is always a pretty quiet time of the year, we might have to wait actually until middle of August before we see the kernels market kick into some life. In Europe, of course, the euro and the strength of the dollar, let's say, against the euro is affecting buyers. Buyers who typically buy spot or prompt material find that particularly difficult. Although, as someone pointed out to me earlier this morning, well, they could buy in euro in West Africa, and that can work very well. If we look at a little bit downstream, we see market reports from India, actually news reports from India. I was reading in the Hindu newspaper, an Indian national newspaper this week, that cashew demand is very strong. A couple of very well-known cashew processors, a distributor, all telling us that demand is strong in India. It was interesting to note also that they mentioned that demand for premium grades, W210s, W180s, was impacted. So maybe the hangover from the COVID lockdowns is that people are a little bit more price conscious. We see the US imports still very strong. Europe a little bit less so, kind of understandable given the currency situation, but also given the very strong start to the year that we saw in Europe. Retailers tell me that the trends in healthy food still very strong, still good news for nuts. I think we need to be really careful here. We can read things into the war in Ukraine, for example, that may not really be true in terms of their impact on this business. We can talk about inflation, but again, we don't actually know the impact of inflation on demand. What we do know at the moment is that there's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not good for business. It's not good for buying decisions. Look in Europe, look in North America to really important markets for Vietnam particularly. It's summer, it's hot, there's a certain amount of uncertainty. It's not surprising that buyers are not overly active right now. So we have to be very careful. There's a lot of really poor analysis of the impact of these various events on the market. And I'd just go back and remind you again, when the pandemic struck, everyone said that cashew demand would fall out of bed. What did it do? Exact opposite. It went through the roof. And it's still there, as I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So let's have a look then at the raw cashew nut trade, and we'll start with Vietnam. If we look at the Vietnamese situation, and on the screen you see first half imports for 4 years, 19, 20, 21, which is a corrected figure. The official Vietnamese figure was 1.7 million tons. It's not correct. They know it's not correct. We know it's not correct. So this is my effort to try and get a more accurate figure and then compare it to this year. So there's a couple of things in particular to note. First of all, imports are down in Vietnam, that's for sure. That was partially due to quite a high carry-in transit stock. I think we also have to get used to the fact that first half imports into Vietnam will continue to be high, but mostly based on imports from Cambodia. And that could mean that future demand for early shipments, countries like Ghana, Benin that have quite early availability of the product, but also Cote d'Ivoire, they might see a more difficult trend for early shipments into the future as the Cambodian crop gets larger. If we look at the cumulative picture, we can see certainly Vietnamese imports are down, but compared to 2020 first half or compared to 2019, and as you can see, the bar on the yellow bar on the right hand side, we are miles ahead of 2020 or 2019. So there really is a question here about, are we making the right kind of comparisons? Then looking at India, Indian imports on raw cashew nuts are ahead of last year. In fact, they're ahead of any of the recent years. Looks to me as if we could be looking at possibly a record import in India. First half, we have figures to the end of May. Anecdotally, first half looks strong. Could have been in anticipation of strong demand, in which case they would have been right. It could also have been in anticipation of a weakening rupee, in which case they would have been white. So we're not quite sure of the exact factors, but it does appear that we're looking at a situation where Indian imports of RCN are quite healthy, and you can see that the cumulative figure to the end of May is ahead of any year going back to 2018. Moving on to kernels, and we're going to look first of all at Vietnam's export of kernels. And you know, there's a lot of depression around these figures. There's a lot of people telling us, oh, our exports are down, this is bad news. This is the second best June on record. The second best June on record. And when we look at the figures month by month, the red bar is 2022 month by month. The others are 19, 20, and 21. We can see there is a decrease, but that it's quite a minor decrease, and it is explained by, it's about 20,000 tons down on exports, and half of that is explained by a decrease to China, which is due to the COVID situation in China, and particularly due to business in the first quarter of the year. The rest of it is due to a mixture of factors, but including the US. And there is a part of a reason for that too, related to African cashew exports. So if we look at exports overall from Vietnam in 2022, yes, down, I think it's about 7% on last year. Don't get too depressed about this, because exports from Vietnam are 28% higher than they were at this time any year pre-pandemic. This marks a very strong underlying trend. And I wonder if, when we look at this, comparing 2022 with 2021, I just wonder if we're actually making the right comparison at all. Maybe we should be looking at the years before the pandemic for a real read of how the trend is. We get some help with that if we look at the US figures. US figures this year are quite healthy. So these are figures to the end of May. You'll notice I mentioned that US shipments from Vietnam were down. That mostly was in June, but it's also partially explained by a growth in the share of African exporters. So US imports from Africa are up 54% in the first 5 months of 2022. Before we get too excited with a number like plus 54%, that brings the market share up from 4% to 6%. Good progress, but still we should bear in mind it's a pretty small market share for the continent that produces about 60% of the world's cashews. So still a lot of work to be done. Generally, pretty healthy numbers from the US, especially healthy if you're an African cashew processor. Looking at the EU, so we have rather special circumstances in the EU right now. We have a situation where we have inflation, quite a lot of uncertainty post-Brexit, and a war in Eastern Europe. So I thought I'd look at cost. We did a little comparison on cost. And what we looked at was, we looked at the cost in euros for a spot or a prompt shipment of 320s from Vietnam on the 13th of July 2019, 2021, and 2022, taking into account the differences in freight. And actually, when you look at it, you do find an increase in cost, but it's about an 8% increase in cost. Now that's a lot, because margins for a lot of roasters and packers in Europe, in everywhere, but especially in Europe, are very tight. And secondly, just a qualifier, these are spot positions, spot foreign exchange. Most buyers, they don't buy spot. Most European buyers tend to buy forward. Certainly the larger ones do. So the three dynamics are in play. Much stronger dollar against the euro, number one, partially offset by a lower kernels price, especially from Vietnam. Initially impacted by much higher freight rates in 2021. So in 2021, we had higher freight rates, lower kernels costs. Now, why does higher freight rates make such an impact if kernels prices are lower? Well, the fact is that when people buy forward, they mostly buy FOB. So they don't get the benefit of the lower kernels price on their forward contracts, but they do get the impact of the higher freight rates. So when freight rates for a 20-foot container went to $10,000, that still had to be paid, and the buyer wasn't getting a discount to compensate, naturally and rightly so. So this snapshot is just about a moment in time, a day in the year, compared to over 3 years, and we do see higher costs. The lesson from this is not about whether people are impacted on their bottom line. The lesson is that based on these changes in price, there's not likely to be any fundamental negative impact on demand. Cashews as a raw material have many times been much higher cost than they are today. Rarely have they been cheaper. They have been cheaper, but rarely. I don't see any big impact on demand coming for the current factors. Let's have a look at the actual imports and what we see when we look at imports. So let's just compare. So we've got imports on the left-hand side in the bars, and you can see a very positive upward trend. And on the right-hand side, you've got prices of 320s FOB over the same period, 2015 through to 2021. Generally a positive trend, but it's got one interruption in it, 2018. So we can see that the very high prices, and that's $5.25 was the high of 320s. There probably wasn't much traded at that price, but that was the high mentioned price in the market. When we look at that, we see that prices have been much higher than they were today, number one. But we also see that the high prices and the volatility impacted an otherwise very steady upward trend, and imports were down a little in 2018. Mind you, shortly afterwards, they returned to a very, very positive trend. And I think that will be maintained. So the impact of higher costs may be seen this year in a small way, but probably next year in a much greater way. And what we may be seeing now is, to a certain extent, the impact of uncertainty. It seems to me that the higher costs don't impact demand as much as we might think they do. Certainly, demand doesn't work in the same short-term price cycles as we can observe prices over the last, I suppose, over the last 14 months or so. But look out for a sting in the tail in this European market. We have the Football World Cup in November for the first time ever. That can be a period of additional demand. November and December, for which people would be buying latest in end of August, September. There might be something to that. So keep a close eye on European demand. Also keep a close eye. I see some analysts predicting the euro to strengthen again from September and inflation to slow down. But of course, as always, there are as many opinions as there are people on these factors. So overall then, the outlook, as I'm seeing it right now, is continued relatively steady RCN prices. Kernels prices probably staying quiet. If there are dips, as we've seen recently in price, buyers will be in there to pick them up, especially beneficial for American buyers. If we look at the overall picture in the kernels market, thinking in 12 months rather than in 1 or 2 months, there is a potential for a rebound. Look for positive news on the euro, particularly on interest rates, which will impact the currency. But also, we're probably going to see, they're telling us, new waves of COVID-19 in Europe. It's already well up on where it was. It's not the disease, and it doesn't have the impact that it had in 2020 or 21, but it still has an impact. Keep an eye on those. Also, I think probably, as we talked about, we did a lot of talking about Vietnam in the last 2 events, and I think we can more than likely assume that there will be reduced processing, which obviously reduces supply, And it's not as if that processing can switch quickly elsewhere. That too can impact on the availability of kernels. And I think overall we can probably say that there still is a significant opportunity for African processors to supply markets in Europe and the United States in particular, but generally markets everywhere. So for the next weeks, I think relatively quiet market. Look for the signals. I wouldn't be surprised if this thing stays quiet until second week of August. But generally, I don't think that the picture is as alarming or as negative as we might think reading some of the market reports from brokers and traders. So that's the market. We'll have a look now at policy. So our main subject for today is to try and get an answer, or even to look at the parameters of the question. Is cashew policy supporting the sector? So we're talking here about the actions of government, the actions of regulators, supports, laws, impediments to trade, the trading environment, and all of those actions. And I've been looking at this now for really the last 3 years, and we've certainly seen an upsurge in public engagement in the cashew sector. We're seeing now new regulation in Ghana. We've seen a whole, a plethora of interventions in Cote d'Ivoire since 2013. We're seeing Burkina Faso, Benin, almost every cashew country has done something on policy or regulation in recent years. And for me, there's a little bit of there's a difficulty with this. And I sympathize with regulators and policymakers because we're looking at a volatile market. And if we look at our volatile market and we look at the difficulty of market information, if we look at the difficulty of analysis, if we look at how much of the analysis that's provided is not independent, is self-serving, comes from private sector actors with their own agendas, it is a very difficult thing to do. But on the other hand, we would also have to, I think, suggest that maybe governments and regulators don't do enough to understand the market. So we see market volatility, we see an environment with low levels or poor levels of market information, and then we see the regulatory response. Governments intervene, they take action. Poor market information combined with, let's say, overambitious goals does have the impact of causing a kind of a short-termism. It's common in the cashew business. We've talked about it on this event before. But if we look at a situation where you think short-term about something like policy, about something like regulation, you tend to get into a situation where you get unintended impacts. Lower farm gate prices, for example. So this kind of a circle of volatility, poor information, regulatory response, unintended consequences leads to further market volatility, and the cycle goes on. And as I say, it's not easy. I do sympathize with policymakers, but it is controllable. So we'll have a look now at the level of policy and regulation around the world. And then we'll have a quick look at India. We'll have a look at some developments in the European Union, and then we'll focus back on African countries. So starting, first of all, with the level of policy and regulation on a global basis. So on the slide, you can see some countries in red. They would be highly regulated. There'd be a lot of perhaps bureaucracy, but perhaps also support mechanisms. And then you have the orange countries where it's somewhere in between, and the green where regulation is relatively light. And I've just pointed out 3 countries where there are, in fact 4, where there are significant changes happening in recent times. Ghana, which we'll hear about more later. Benin, where there's a whole review of the policy and regulation ongoing. Tanzania, where we've seen some interesting changes to the way that the export auction works. And of course, Cambodia, which is currently developing its own cashew policy, following on from the huge upsurge in production. What we can see from this is that some very successful countries have relatively light regulation, and some very successful countries have relatively high levels of regulation. So there's no template. And the more you look at policy and regulation, the more you come to the conclusion that what's really important is getting it right for the economic environment, for the social environment of a particular region, rather than simply copying perhaps what seems to work next door. We do have some problems with our concepts around regulation, and particularly those of us who are working in the African cashew sector regularly. We often assume that the successful countries in Asia, especially obviously India and Vietnam, we often assume that they are highly regulated, highly supported, and that some people would feel that African exporters have no choice, no chance to compete with the Asian competitors. But when we look at the Asian sectors, and we'll have a quick look at India, we'll find that it's not really so heavily supported as we might think. First of all, looking at production in India, and I would like to just mention at this stage the Pro Cashew project, which has given me an opportunity to work on some of these policy issues recently. And I know that they're doing a lot of work in this area. And of course, the African Cashew Alliance has been active in this area for the last few years too. Going back to India, and just ask the question, is the Indian cashew sector heavily supported? Look at production, look at RCN trade, look at processing. Starting with production, and you'd have to say in India there are plenty of initiatives, but not so many results. Relatively modest target, increase the production area by 120,000 hectares. That would give them something like 105,000 tons additional RCN if it were at current average yields. There is work to develop high yielding varieties and some really good work in that area. But so far, it doesn't appear that Indian production is on a fast upward trend. If we look at the other 2 areas, I break them into 2 aspects. First of all, protection. So the Indian cashew sector is highly protected. As you know, India is a net importer. India is the largest market in the world. And the primary protection for the Indian processing sector is import duty. It is essentially impossible to legally import cashew kernels to India nowadays. RCN you can bring in. The RCN trade is impacted by an import duty if the nuts are eventually consumed in India. But generally it's a protected market. That's why we have prices, 320s, 350 to 390 compared to the international market. That's why we have 350,000 tons already flowing into India, and that could reach 1 million by the end of the year. If we look at the supports, yes, there are plenty of supports for the Indian sector in terms of grant aid, but these are relatively modest. The supports offered to processors in India are tiny compared to the supports offered, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire. So when we look at India, it's not particularly highly supported, but it is protected. And what's it protected from? It's protected from what would be a massive flow of Vietnamese cashew kernels into India if those import tariffs were removed. And that protects somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million jobs in the Indian cashew processing sector. Are these areas that stop African processors competing elsewhere? Not at all. India's exports have been falling for many years, and it looks like we've reached a level from which it will not recover back to its market share. You could say a lot of the same things about Vietnam. It's not a domestic market, but supports for the sector in Vietnam are relatively modest, and so they should be. It's a well-established sector. Thinking that African processors cannot compete with India or Vietnam because of government policy or supports in those countries is no longer accurate. There's absolutely no reason related to policy in India or Vietnam that African processors should think they don't have a chance to compete. We're kind of looking backwards a little bit to two sectors that have been really well established, but I want to show you something now which is coming down the road and could have a huge impact. So we're going to look at a development on food law and supply chain responsibility in the European Union, and it's starting in Germany. It's called the German Supply Chain Act. And essentially what this does, initially for large companies, but it will spread to smaller companies as time goes on, and there is, I think, a timetable for that. The German Supply Chain Act, what it tries to do is to make buyers, including retailers, accountable for what happens in their supply chain, primarily focused on human rights. So we're talking there about labor practice, how growers are treated, how suppliers are treated in the chain, and sustainability, environmental sustainability. And this means traceability, of course. So it's going to be very difficult to meet the parameters of this act in the current supply chain. It really lends itself to a situation where the product is grown and processed and exported to Germany, in this case, from the country of origin. Our supply chain doesn't seem fit for purpose in the context of this act. And indeed, if we look at the US Food Safety Modernization Act, a strict interpretation of that would also suggest that the cashew nuts should be processed in the origin that they grow to fully meet the parameters of that act. Now, Germany is a leader, by the way. It's been a leader in food law, and it now seems to be a leader in supply chain accountability. The European Union is quite likely to introduce a similar act sometime in the next 3 to 5 years. And it's more than likely to be more stringent than the German Supply Chain Act. So this is a really good opportunity for African processors, because as things stand, for most of the production in the world, it's only African processors that can meet the requirements in a strict interpretation. Now, we're going to have to see how that develops, but that's the way it looks right now. We need to be aware of this. We need to be looking at what it means for the cashew sector, and we need to be looking at the opportunity. So we've had a look at India. I've mentioned Vietnam briefly. We've had a look at this. This is a train coming down the tracks at us, this German Supply Chain Act. It can have a huge impact on all businesses, but particularly on the cashew business, where about 2 million tons of RCN is shipped for processing in Asia from Africa every year. So let's focus in then back to Africa, back to policy in Africa. We'll have a look at some of the types of policy and some of the types of supports that are offered. Again, you can see the traffic light system. Green is low regulation, red is high regulation, and the orange color is somewhere in between. And we see the typical interventions. So just about everywhere has an export tax or an export levy on raw cashew nuts, used for different purposes in different places. But just about everyone has them. They tend to be much higher in East Africa. Mozambique and Tanzania both have very high export taxes, and a little bit lower in West Africa. We see, staying with RCN, we see different ways of trying to manage the chain. Most of these evolved in East Africa, where it is really difficult to compete historically, for processors to compete. Although we should remind ourselves, don't forget, East Africa was the leading producer and processor of cashew nuts if we go back to the 1970s. But when we look at how the RCN chain is managed, we see, I suppose, three things. We see the export ban, complete ban on exports of raw cashew nuts, which is in Kenya, a small producer, is possibly on the way in Benin, has been announced in Benin for 2024. And we see other versions of that. So a short-term ban, or what they call an export window. So for example, a couple of months, usually early in the season, when the export of RCN is banned, so processors can buy. Other kinds of intervention, again, turning to the farm gate, price control now is quite common. Minimum prices, reference prices, quite common across the sector. And we see supports coming in for processing. And the most significant supports, of course, are in Côte d'Ivoire, a direct subsidy for processors. We're going to have a look at these again later in terms of whether they work or not, and the impact of these different kinds of policy and regulatory measures. So we break them into, or at least I break them into three areas: processing, regulation of the raw cashew nut trade, and production. And we'll start with production. And you can see a whole range of types of intervention. So really effective policy development of varieties, research and development of varieties, really well done in Tanzania, famously well done in Tanzania. Recently well done in Nigeria with new high quality varieties. We see minimum farm gate pricing, either as a legal minimum or as a guide price or as a reference price, and we see that across the sector. We look at technical support for farmers, something that really works, whether it's done by the government or done by NGOs, been shown to work. The impact on farm yields is pretty spectacular in the right environments. We see what I think is really important is the post-harvest infrastructure. I'll tell you why I think it's really important. Because if we think about it, if Vietnam buys around about 2 million tons of raw cashew nuts every year, and if in the last 2 years, more and more of that has come from Cambodia, that means that Vietnamese buyers will come later to Africa to buy, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. As they arrive later, that material needs to be managed. That's where a post-harvest infrastructure, proper drying, proper storage, really comes into play. Otherwise, the product will lose quality. Some of the product itself will be lost, and there will be serious problems for farmers. So post-harvest infrastructure, in a situation where some of the urgency, at least for Vietnamese buyers, has gone out of the RCN market, means that either we return to the bad old days. 15 years ago, farm gate price is $200 a ton, or we improve the infrastructure so that there are places to store nuts, traders to buy them, mechanisms to make sure that those nuts are well managed. Other aspects of processing, farmer information. We see farmer market information improved everywhere, and we see every variety and every type of market information available. Delivery is a real issue. Understanding is a real issue. Information without helpful clues on what that information means. Information which treats farmers as if they're stupid, which they definitely are not. They know what they're doing, but they need good information and they need to know what that information means. And we've seen a couple of famous examples. These text messages going around saying buy, sell, hold. This is really not helpful. Export quality regulation. We see that Cote d'Ivoire is the best example of that. Now, if we look at the effectiveness of all of these kinds of interventions, I've just kind of coded this up so it's blue, and the darker blue would tend to tell us which is more effective. And as we go into the orange color, it shows what I would suggest is less effective. So I think that technical support for farmers is highly effective. I think that linking farmers to processors is highly effective. But I think that minimum farm gate prices and reference pricing, whereas it's a good idea, hasn't worked very well for a lot of reasons. Some political, others market analysis, market information reasons where prices have been hit at the wrong levels. If you set a minimum price and the market can't manage that minimum price, you either need to have a renegotiation system, you need to have a system where you can amend the market price according to the market conditions, or you need to get it right in the first place. Tough one for regulators. The difficulty is often setting it too high, because then it's completely unenforceable. But there's also a difficulty, obviously, if you set it too low, because you tend to set the agenda for the season. Eventually it finds its level. But I think this is really challenging. So I feel that the real areas of ineffective policy with regard to production are around the management of minimum pricing, export quality regulation, and market information. The other areas are effective. That, by the way, that doesn't mean they've been implemented well. We're talking here about whether the policy can be effective or not. Implementation is a whole different matter. A good policy, poorly implemented, doesn't have the right impact. So when we look at production, we see a wide range of measures. We see most of them can be quite effective. Not all of them particularly well implemented, but some of them, and we can look at improvements in yield, improvements in quality as really outstanding examples of success in this area. Really, I think there are examples in every country, but outstanding in the last couple of years has been Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria, for at least part of its export of raw cashew nuts. Moving on to the RCN trade, just keeping an eye on the time. If we look at the raw cashew nut trade, we see different ways of regulating it. Export windows exists in Mozambique. It probably looks as if it may be introduced elsewhere. We have post-harvest improvement. This improves the quality of the RCN, has a big impact on the trade, and we've seen this very effectively done in Tanzania and in Cote d'Ivoire. We see export duties just about everywhere. I won't go into that one too much. Then we see something that's really complex: warehouse receipt systems, auctions, holding systems. I've seen in the last couple of years, I've seen so many different versions of this. Famously, Tanzania introduced the warehouse receipt system and the export auction back in 2008. I mention Ethiopia because there's an example there. It's not cashews, but it's a very good example of in fact, unfortunately, the damage that can be done in such a system. And the last one I wanted to mention is the building of links between growers and exporters. And this is really, really important to my mind. So when we look at them, export windows, they can work and have worked, but there is an issue there. If, for example, I think Mozambique is a good example of this. If one of your competitive advantages is that your crop happens at a time when most people don't have a fresh crop, October, November, December, for example, actually the export window removes part of your competitive advantage. So unless you're processing, 80, 90% of your crop, you are actually going to lose some value by having a ban on export of RCN. And whether or not that is a good trade-off against the benefit to processors is very difficult to know. Probably in Mozambique, the example still needs to be answered, and maybe we're going to hear about that a little bit later. Post-harvest infrastructure. Really strong in terms of its impact. I think whatever we do in this area, it should be linked to the market and linked to the farm gate prices. Because the big question about export taxes, for example, is who actually pays them? And what we have seen in the past, when export taxes were introduced in some countries, not just in cashews, but in other products too, is that farm gate prices have fallen. So we need to be really careful when we look at what we do on export taxation. Because if one individual country introduces a higher export tax, it may be that the farmers in that country get a lower price because the market functions internationally. Multiple origins, multiple continents, multiple qualities. So introducing an export tax can have an impact on the farm gate price. And I think that's been evident in East Africa. And we come to the most, probably, certainly from my point of view, the most controversial and the most difficult one is this whole area of warehouse receipt systems and auctions. What we have seen, the evidence in areas where this has been established, is that it's been very bad for processing. It's had a really negative impact on processors who are perhaps forced to source in a certain way through an auction. And even in Tanzania, this is now recognized, and they're changing the system so processors can deal directly with co-ops, smaller co-ops, and with farmer groups. Finally, the linkage between exporters and farmers works. There's no doubt about it. So we have a number of areas in the RCN trade, which is probably the most highly regulated aspect of the sector. We have areas where there are examples of outstanding success, areas of big question marks. I would say export windows, the level of export taxation, the imposition of marketing systems, warehouse receipt systems, export auctions. The impact of those really has to be considered carefully by regulators. So let's just have a look then in a global way at processing and see what's worked. And if we look in Asia and some parts of Africa, what really works is technical support, training, good market information, and access to financial services. These things worked in Vietnam, they worked in India, they are working in India. India, as we've mentioned, has this huge protection of the import duty on kernels. Also, tax breaks. So we don't see anywhere offering subsidies to processors except Cote d'Ivoire, but we do see most countries offering some kind of corporation or profits tax breaks on profits, should they make them, but also on the import tariffs on equipment. That's just about everywhere. If we look in African countries, I think we can look at three major support areas: the export window, the retention of a certain amount of the crop for processors, and direct subsidies. These are different things which aren't done in other countries. A lot of those technical things, worker training, technical support is done, but these are the things that work, to my mind. Good market information, technical support, including management support, and access to finance or access to financial services. And that too might actually mean simply access to training and knowledge on financial services as part of the policy of the government in the sector. Potential banana skins. I think the export windows, export bans absolutely are really dangerous. I mean, the evidence on export bans is that the first and immediate reaction is lower farm gate prices. The second reaction is smuggling. And the third reaction is reduced production. So export bans and their cousin export windows need to be really, really carefully considered. In terms of retention of a percentage of the crop for local processing, well, the jury is still out on that one. We don't know. Direct subsidies have absolutely worked to get processing going, but there's a question around direct subsidies. What kind of processors does subsidizing them create? Do they become successful in the long term? What happens when the subsidy is withdrawn? What kind of investor does a direct subsidy attract? What do they use the subsidy for? Does it benefit the growers? Does it stimulate production? So a lot of questions to be asked about that, and fortunately we're going to get a pretty good idea of how they work in Côte d'Ivoire over the next 2 years. But one thing's for sure, they have accelerated the development of processing, or at least the building of processing plants in the country in recent years. So other aspects of trade policy that need to be carefully looked at: management of cross-border trade. So looking on this, on the right-hand side, you can see a crude map of West Africa. The black arrows are legal trade, bringing cashew nuts to port for export. The red arrows are mostly illegal or smuggling. So you can see export from Guinea-Bissau, export from Côte d'Ivoire by road, all of which is illegal, cross-border both ways, Benin, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and so on. This kind of trade certainly reduces revenue, looking back at export taxes, but it also creates a big distortion. And if we look at the trade figures, we see that. So the bar chart you can see on the left-hand side, the yellow bars are the official export figures from Guinea-Bissau, and the green bars are the official import figures, Vietnam and India combined. So we can compare the two figures, and we can see that in many years, the green bars exceed the yellow bars, which means that's roughly the volume of illegal trade. Of course, some of the trade, the origin changes as well as the location. Intriguingly, there are years where the official exports exceeded the official imports. I've yet to come to a conclusion on how that can happen. But we certainly see that this is a big impact factor. Overall then, as we come to the end of this section, we ask the question, is the policy supporting the sector? And when we look at it, I just put this into a kind of map. And what we see is that in certain countries, the standouts would be Vietnam and Nigeria, Togo, are the standout countries where the policy is effective. Nigeria doesn't really have a policy. Nigeria is very, very light regulation. There are some supports for industry. Vietnam is quite a heavily supportive, particularly historically, heavily supportive set of regulations. And that's worked very well, but it's mostly worked well by virtue of support. Elsewhere, it's really just partially effective. I mean, if we look at India, we can say that, well, there is a thriving Indian cashew sector. They, process 1.6, 1.7 million tons of RCN every year. Much of it is processed manually still, so that's a question mark. The cost of processing is high, that's a question mark. It's protected by very high import tariffs on kernels. So does it work? Yes, it does. Is it effective? Well, I'm not really sure. It shouldn't need to be protected to that extent. It should be more cost effective. And if it were, Indian exports could also perhaps return to the market. Elsewhere across Africa, well, we see every different kind of situation. We see largely ineffective systems, and some of those are being reviewed. Tanzania, Benin in particular at the moment, but also Burkina Faso. And we see partially effective. And looking at this, I come back to the conclusion that there is no easy template. The most important thing is to make sure that the policies are adapted to the local environment. But what we can say coming out of this discussion is, I think we can say relatively fairly and relatively accurately that certain things have not worked in the past. Raw cashew nut export bans, cross-border trade bans that aren't enforceable, and they're related to different qualities, different import-export taxes. They're related to all of these regulatory factors, but they may also be related to very logical things, like the nearest port just happens to be in another country. How do you manage that? So there's a lot of areas here that I think need to be addressed. Government fixed prices. When I say fixed prices, I mean trying to fix a price that will be paid to everyone, not a minimum price. This absolutely hasn't worked anywhere because governments simply cannot respond to markets quickly enough to make any sense of doing that. Generally speaking, the complex warehousing mechanisms have not worked. They have either, like in Tanzania, caused farm gate prices to be too low, although I'm glad to see that's changing now. It's changed this year and it'll be improving, I think, in the coming years. But I do also see worrying developments talking about very complex marketing systems for raw cashew nuts, which in my opinion are absolutely likely to reduce farm gate price, make processors' lives more difficult, and they need to be very carefully considered. Processing, I put this in as, it's not a regulation issue as such, but it's something that should be encouraged. Processing without linking to the producers. I can't see how anyone would build a factory without having a supply chain built at the same time, without forging links to growers, cooperatives, the people that would supply them with their product, and establishing a relationship that allows that to prosper. You know, it's only so long you can go on and say, well, look, I'm going to build a 10,000 ton factory. There's 500,000 tons in the country. It won't be a problem. We'll find someone somewhere. That's thinking about it as a commodity. Then we introduce factors like the German Supply Chain Act. And now you're forced to integrate your supply chain. So to my mind, starting a processing plant without integrating a supply chain is crazy. And I think governments should regulate for that. They should support it, make it easier to do, and incentivize both parties to that. And the final factor, which I think is of real concern, it's certainly of real concern to me, is the setting of unrealistic targets. So things like, we are going to process 45% of all raw cashew nuts by 2024, and you make that announcement in 2021, that is totally unrealistic. It doesn't take into account even the business planning cycle for a cashew processing factory. We see other things, doubling production in 5 years. These things are unrealistic. Unrealistic targets tend to demoralize. Unrealistic targets tend to encourage short-term thinking, which of itself can be destructive. Unrealistic targets can cause investors to just see a government or a regulatory setup that isn't connected to the realities of the business. And this causes them to stand back and to withdraw from the sector because they don't trust it. So, in sales, they always say, don't make promises you can't keep. I think that applies equally to policy and regulation in the cashew sector. Well, let's go over to some people who are day-to-day involved in these areas and advising in these areas. Thanks for listening to me, and I'd like to go back to Blessing, who will introduce our guests. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Today we have two people joining us from Mozambique. Is Lucia Antonio, who is the head of Department of Trade and Agri-Industry, the Institute of Nuts, Mozambique. And the second person is Foster Boateng, who is the Acting Deputy Chief Executive Officer, the Tree Crop Development Authority of Ghana. They are presently online. Jim, who would you want us to invite first? Who would you want us to interact with first?
Well, the way I have it on the screen, Lucia Antonio first perhaps would be a good idea.
Hello, Lucia, can you hear us?
Yes, hello, Blessing. Good morning, Blessing. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you with us. I've seen a lot of your analysis and work on the sector, and it's really impressive, and it's really good to see the steps that are being made forward. We've been talking, as you heard, about policy, and I'm interested to know, what are the changes that have taken place in the way the Mozambique cashew sector is regulated over the last couple of years?
Thank you, Jim. Over the last 2 years, we start to work on the revision of our cashew law, because it was designed in the last 20 years. So we have to adjust with the dynamics of the markets. So we started to elaborate, and now the new cashew law is under the ministry, because we already heard all the stakeholders, from the producer, traders, exporters, and processors, even the NGOs. But what are the news of this new regulation? We have seen the growing of Burma kernels, and the advantage or disadvantage of that is low kernel processing is being worked on the factory. So the new regulation is intended to free or exemption for kernel exports, but put tax for Burma kernels, and increase the raw cashew nuts tax from 18% to 22%. And also, the new law established the right to export to all national and international company, because in the past regulation, only the national linked to international company could export, but now we are opening. We also redefine the export tax to be linked to support research, and also we increase the incentive to industry, and also on our program of increased production. What we have seen in the last years, the government was mainly involved in production and also an integrated pest management. We know that Mozambique faces the aging and the incidence of pests and disease, but now there's no new law. We are linked so much involvement of the private sector on production and integrated pest management. We will also set up plantation of cashew seedling in semi-arid regions. We are developing new varieties. We are in the past we are using only the cashew seedling, but now we are going to production of polyclonal seedling. That's what the new laws is bringing. Thank you.
Wow, quite extensive changes. I like the way you put it, Lucia, that the law is being updated. The market has changed and now the law must change with it. I think that's a really good way to put it. I wanted to ask you, will there be any supports for processors apart from perhaps the higher taxation of the RCN and apart from the taxation of exports of Burma kernels? Are there any other supports for processors in the pipeline?
Like Jim, we are working with the new minister. So in this new ventures, we are finding that we have the programs called the rescue of the processor company, because too many huge company is facing financing issue. So the government is very aware about this and is working to provide support. And likely by the end of this year, we can have this company get into the market. What we have seen, we also have issues, the long-term land use and benefits right for new investor on processing, the free import of machinery, equipment, and the goods, and also facilitation of the issues of entry visas and the residents to work in Mozambique. Most importantly is to assure that the new investor, they are provide knowledge transference to the local work and the local processor as well.
That's interesting. It's sometimes forgotten that Mozambique, in terms of the percentage of the crop processed, Mozambique is the leading country in Africa. It was also one of the first countries to introduce support measures, regulatory measures into the sector. And because they've been in place for so long, sometimes that's forgotten, especially at this time of year and especially as West African production has grown. But it looks like you're set to reinvigorate the processing sector.
Yes, Jim. We have faced a surprise when in 2019 or 2020, Olam announced that is going to leaving the country. So this was a very strategical for the Mozambique government to start to look at the local processor as well. Because when the multinational company has reached their goal, they can leave you without any excuses. So it's a very important now, the new dynamic and the new policy that is being setting. We are also not only attracting the new investor, but also invest in the local processor, because since the colonization, we have the tradition of processing. So we need to work in this small processor to reinvigorate it, and they can also start to export to international market. The knowledge is there.
Very good. And when do you think these changes will come into effect? What's the likely timeline?
Let's talk about maybe from this next 10 years, is a process, but we are very happy this year, last year, the past 2 years were very, very, very hard for the processing industry in Mozambique. But this year, the processor will buy bought already 46,000 metric ton in comparison. And last year they bought only 13, and we also see an increase of investors that are already interact with the Mozambique government to set up companies in Mozambique.
Well, we look forward to seeing a rejuvenated Mozambique processing sector. And it's nice to see that the thinking is long term. And it's nice to see that the Mozambican government is not afraid to make changes when necessary. Lucia, if you would stay with us, we'll see if some questions are coming forward. But I'd like to move now to Foster Boateng of the Tree Crops Development Authority of Ghana, the acting Deputy Chief Officer.
Thank you, Jim. And that was a very fantastic presentation. I think later on we'll follow up on some of the issues you raised. Very, very thought-provoking. My name is Foster Boateng, as you've really mentioned, and I'm very glad to be on this program. Thank you.
You're very welcome. We see Ghana has a long history in cashews, of course, and we have seen in the past small factories come and go from time to time. But there seems to be a renewed interest from the government in the development of the sector. Foster, tell us what's going on. What can we expect in Ghana from a regulation and policy perspective in the coming years?
Thank you, Jim. I think you tee off very well by saying that Ghana has a huge potential, but again, we can't eat potential. Turning around, we have seen that we need to improve the cashew industry. And we are looking at 3 areas. First of all, we're looking at improving the enabling environment in terms of regulatory and policy, as you've mentioned. And then our second one, we are trying to improve research and development for competitive and sustainable production and marketing system. And we're also looking at a vibrant and efficient private sector involvement in the sector. Let me just come back to the policy. I think listening to you and looking at the various countries you presented, I would say when it comes to policy, we are nascent because we have just established what we call the Tree Crop Development Authority by Act of Parliament. The role of the authority is to regulate the industry and then also promote or develop the industry, because we know our industry is underdeveloped. Though a lot of work has been done by a number of NGOs and other institutions, but there's more to be done. In the last couple of years, this authority has been set up in 2019, was launched in 2020, and currently we are now getting the full complement of staff. However, we have been able to put together a regulation that is before Parliament to be approved. We've also been able to tee off our strategy, a 5-year strategy that will enable us achieve the 3 areas I mentioned: enabling regulatory environment, research and development for competitive and sustainable production and marketing system, and then also vibrant private sector. So basically, this is what we have done now in the last couple of years. Over.
So, Foster, when do you see, this is a very difficult question, I suppose, because I'm going to ask you about how long it's going to take. When do you see these factors as having a real impact in Ghana? Can we expect something from next season, or will it be later than that?
Well, I think it could be very early in the day, but I would say that we have really, when it comes to areas to do with maybe production, I think our production levels are very low. And if you look at our cashew development policy document that crop services developed, we are trying to look at how we increase our area under cultivation for cashew from the 2017 base figure of 107,000 hectares we are projecting that by 2028, we should be hitting about 300,000 hectares. And I think steps are being taken to do that. One thing we are doing is how to get improved seeds and improved planting materials into the hands of smallholder farmers, materials that command high genetic advantage. So we can see a lot of interest in farmers who now want to expand their farms. One immediate thing that we have also done recently is looking at the pricing mechanism. Farm gate prices, together with the value chain actors and all the stakeholders, we managed to put in place a pricing mechanism that would enable us to at least determine a minimum farm gate price, and that has incentivized farmers. In fact, this year, more farmers came for planting materials, they want to expand. That's an immediate quick wins that I can say that this policy has brought. But when it comes to cashew products, value-added products, we don't set prices. We allow the market forces to determine the prices.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Setting farm gate prices or putting in place a mechanism to make sure you get it right. You know, a mechanism that's fair to the farmer, but workable in the market. It's a big challenge.
It is, Jim. It is, Jim. We know we are set up for, nobody told us the tax would be easy, but with the help of the value chain actors and all the stakeholders, we all have agreed a certain pricing mechanism that is self-regulated. If prices in the world market drops, it also drops. The farmers have agreed. And so, and then also not only the prices, at a certain required standard and quality as well.
Yeah, I think that the linking of the price to qualities really can be a very constructive factor. We often see minimum farm gate prices that are, you know, just a price without mentioning a quality. Whereas in Ghana in particular, you have some very high quality cashew nuts growing. And that has to be taken into account when establishing prices.
That's correct. So we insist that farmers sell at a certain moisture level and a certain not 10 ratio. Otherwise, you are going to get the minimum price. So you are going to get a lower price than the minimum price set. So that is the premise on which this pricing mechanism was established. But as I said, when it comes to the other cashew products, we don't actually set the prices. Let the market forces determine. We are trying to incentivize farmers to really expand the production.
It sounds very sensible. So if we look at, say, 300,000 hectares, the figure you mentioned, we could be looking at production then, what, 160, 180,000 tons?
Well, I think currently we are doing close to about 140, 130,000 metric tons. And so we are trying to look at if we can move our production to maybe 250,000 to 300,000, because the yields are very low. If we can improve on the yield, probably we may not need to put more land under cultivation and maybe cost vertical expansion in production.
Right. So improve productivity as well as some extension.
Yes, sure. So that is why I said most of our focus and the support we are going to give in our strategy, we are looking at 4 focus areas: research and development, where we are trying to focus more on research and good varieties that can be handed over to farmers. There are lessons to be learned from Nigeria. I listened to your presentation. I've noted it. We need to learn from Nigeria how we can improve research and development, not only just scientific research as well as such, but also how does the market inform research so that we develop the kind of product that the market is looking for. Extension is key. We believe that it's not only planting materials, but we also look at soil, integrated soil fertility, integrated pests management, and then as well as extension support. But again, as we haven't been able to invest in irrigation, we can say that we pray to God for rain.
Well, of course, yeah. I suppose I'm looking at this, all of this is being done in the framework of climate change, which should make, I guess, should make more land more suitable for cashew nuts than for some other crops.
That is true. That's correct. We see cashew and rubber sequestrate more carbon than oil palm. But again, we are trying to really tread cautiously in some of these tree crops. And we are trying to, our buzzword here is we are looking at sustainable and competitive. Sustainable in the sense that we are taking the environment into consideration. And then also we are looking at social inclusion as much as possible.
Thanks very much, Foster. I think we'll just, the two words you use, sustainable and competitive, this makes a lot of sense. But let's go back to Blessing. Thank you, Foster. Thank you, Lucia. And let's go back to Blessing and see if there are any comments or questions. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have just a question from Herman Abiona, who is asking about the suppression of cashew exports. What are the effects on the position of the country in question at the international markets?
Well, what we've seen in the past, now we don't have too many examples in the cashew sector of export bans or partial export bans, but what we have seen in those countries where it's been tried, what we have seen is a fairly quick reduction in the farm gate price. We've seen, I suppose, for export bans, it's gone in three stages. Initially, we see a lower farm gate price. Then we see less maintenance of trees and a reduction in productivity, because generally speaking, in the countries that it's been tried in, there isn't a high enough level of processing to match the production. So when you ban the export, the price at the farm gate falls. The following season, farmers tended to reduce the care and the time and the money spent on their trees. And then over the longer period, and there are only 3 examples of this in the world, and they're all small examples, but over the longer term, then we saw a reduction in production. So I think that the use of an export ban, particularly an outright and total ban, can have a significant long-term impact on production. The other risk, of course, is smuggling or cross-border trade, which, okay, it might sustain farm gate prices for a while, but it's generally a very risky position for growers to find themselves in. So, whereas we don't have many examples of this, Herman, what I would say is that the examples that we do have tend to point to the fact that the export bans have not worked, and the impact has been on the grower. Now, having said that, I would also say that in the countries where it was tried, the level of processing, or the processing as a proportion of the overall crop, was relatively low. So instead of processing rising to meet production, what happened in those countries was production fell to meet processing. And that the reason, if you look at export bans, it might appear on the face of it that it would be very attractive for investors. But in actual fact, it's not the kind of regulation that's attractive for investors. They might start asking themselves the question, well, if the government's banning the export of RCN today, what will they do tomorrow? And that's been the history of it, but it's not an extensive history. This is not a measure that's been tried in too many places. Thanks for that good question. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have a next question, but this is addressed to Lucia. Lucia, I believe you are online. The person wants to know if you can share the contents of the cashew law in Mozambique.
If I can share, can you come again, please?
Yes. So the person wants to know if you can share the contents of the cashew law in Mozambique.
Okay. I will be briefly because it's very long, but The cashew law was designed in 1999. Why on the cashew value chain, and it also to develop the cashew sector. The cashew law established a window to export in order to protect the processor, and also draw the export tax. With this export, with the export tax defined, it was 18%, 180%. And now with the new cashew law, we want to increase for 22%. What we are doing with the tax export, the tax export revenue is invested on the program of production and also to support industry. In Mozambique has a huge incidence of pest and disease. So it's necessary to have a complementary program to support these programs so that we have to leverage production and productivity. In the new cashew law, the money is not only going to production, but it's also going to invest on research, because it's very important with the climate change to develop new varieties, and also the terms of polytonal seeds, it needs an investment. So basically, the cashew law intends to set up principle and guide the cashew regulation. I talked briefly that nowadays we are having the increase of former kernels, and with the new cashew law there is also a tax to protect the kernel export, because there is an exemption of exporters of kernels. Regarding of banning export, Mozambique is not going for this trend, because we know that if we ban export now, we have low farm gate prices. We will demotivate the farmers, and also we will not have the reinvestment of this money and the program to development the sectors. And for more specific articles of the cashew law, I can share with the colleague from Beni. We have the emails and we can exchange for more details, so that we can have Fitzpatrick on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Jim, would you like to add something before I ask the next question?
No, let's go to our participants.
Okay, we have the next question for Foster. The question goes like this: is Ghana going to implement export tax this year? What is the rate? What are the mechanisms to regularly review the export tax, if any, is being planned for this year?
Thank you, Blessing. Actually, there's not going to be export tax this year. We have now sent our levies and charges to Parliament. And initially, we had named it three crop taxes and levies, and they said, no, we cannot take those ones because it contradicts with what GIPC has on exports of some agricultural commodities. So we had to come back and revise our notes, and we call it tree crop development fund or levy that people need to contribute for us to build. Because remember, the role of TCDA is to regulate and also develop those value chains. So what I know is for cashew, if we are importing cashew to Ghana, we have no tax, there's no tax on it, RCN. But if we are exporting RCN, TCDA takes a levy of 0.75% per ton, per ton. Hello?
Yes, Foster.
Yeah, so but until Parliament approves our proposal, we are not going to charge anything until we receive approval from Parliament. It's before Parliament.
Thank you very much, Foster. Jane, would you like to ask any question before we?
I just wanted to clarify with Foster that so it's 0.75%, 0.75% levy, which will be used in the development of the sector. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. The money goes into the tree crop fund. 80% will go into developing the sector. 20% remains with TCDA for its overheads. You see, government has given a seed fund for 2 years, and subsequently, we need to generate our own resources to sustain ourselves.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. It's really interesting. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jane and Foster. Lucia, I hope you are still online with us. I have 2 more questions for you. Can you share any information on how processors have responded to the cashew laws and policies of Mozambique?
So far, the new law is under discussion of all stakeholders, and the most interesting are the processors who work with us and say now it's time to change the law, and all these new initiative or new principle in the new cashew law were already discussed and debated with all stakeholders. We have along the last year was focused on debating with all stakeholders, including processors. So they are very happy with this innovation. So now the law has to be go to the minister to be approved so that we can start to implement. Now we are waiting just for approval from the minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Jane?
Lucia has answered the question really well. Move on to the next one, perhaps, Blessing.
Okay. Lucia, the last one. How is Mozambique in Tanzania?
Can you come again, Blessing?
The participants want to know how Mozambique is being affected by policies in Tanzania.
Oh, that's very interesting. The policy in Tanzania, we have a positive and a negative aspect. The positive aspect is because in Tanzania, the farmers are very, very, very strong in discussion of price. So this experience was brought to Cabo Delgado province. But because we are near Tanzania, during the cashew season, most of our farmers are smuggling the raw cashew nut to sell in Tanzania. So this is something that is quite negative. So both countries need to sit down and work together to solve these issues. And we already know that we are faced with the terrorism attacks in Cabo Delgado. So farmers doesn't have a market, and the near market is Tanzania to sell the raw cashew nuts. So we have negative and positive aspects between two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for the submission. Ren, please, do you have any input?
Well, I think it does bring forward the difficulty of regulating neighboring countries that are all producers. I mean, if we look Tanzania, Mozambique, the production areas obviously are very close together. If we look in West Africa, many borders, many different regulatory systems. many different types of export taxes, types of import taxes, and plenty of incentives for illegal trade, of course, and very difficult to enforce on those borders. There is definitely a conversation that needs to be had about some kind of regional coordination in the development of policy, but I'm not saying that's an easy conversation. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, James. In the absence of any further question, could you please share with us what we should be expecting in the next 2 weeks before we have another session of the GME?
Well, the next time we are going to talk about organic cashews. I'm going to bring you the next GME from the BioFach Organic Trade Fair in Germany. That's 2 weeks from now. We will talk about organic cashews in the coming 2 weeks. I think I'm not expecting any great volatility in the market. I think we might see some additional trade in cashew kernels, but it is a time of year when international buyers, particularly Northern Hemisphere international buyers, are relatively quiet, and I think that will continue for some time. That might bring about some price volatility in Vietnam. You might see again the next time we talk that prices have dipped. I think it'll be short term and it'll pick up again. I'm fairly convinced now that raw cashew nut prices will remain relatively steady for the time being. You may well see variation, but it's mostly going to be on in terms of the available quality. So we might see prices change, but always look for the quality that's offered. It's a time of year that we need to keep a close eye. I would say over the next 3-4 weeks, relatively quiet, and after that, I wouldn't be surprised to see some kind of real life return into the market. I would like to just thank our 2 guests today, Lucia Antonio of the Cashew Institute of Mozambique and Forster Boateng of the Tree Crop Development Authority in Ghana. Thank you both for really good communication, clear, concise explanations of the position on policy and regulation in 2 countries. Very interesting, and thank you for your clear answers to the questions. I'd also say thanks very much to all our participants for their questions. Very interesting questions today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you and talking to you from BioFach in 2 weeks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, Blessing.
Jim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Lucia and Foster, thank you also for joining us today. As Jim has mentioned, the next GME will be on the 27th of July, same time. And we would also like to inform you that we are 61 days to the largest cashew event in Africa, which is the ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. The event will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022. Are you an expert or a newcomer looking to venture into the African cashew industry? This is an event you do not want to miss. Register now at www.acalifeevent.com. We have an early bird rates which are valid right now till the 30th of August. We hope to see you in Abuja. And don't forget to join us again on the 27th of July for the next session of GME. I would like to end by thanking our partners and sponsors who have continually made it possible for us to bring this session to you. And I'm talking about GIZ Move, CNFA Pro Cashew, Maya, SNI, Snag, Benin Technoserve, and our participants joining us every 2 weeks. Thank you very much. And again on the 27th of July. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Visit www.acalifeevents.com to register.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain ACA vous présente la 16e conférence et exposition annuelle sur le cajou. L'édition de cette année se tiendra du 12 au 15 septembre à Sheraton Abuja Hotel situé à Abuja, au Nigeria. Sous le thème « Renforcer le marketing durable des amandes et des produits dérivés dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cajou », rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cajou et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement, pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cajou du monde entier.